What would you do if the only thing you could afford was the one place no one else would touch? For 19-year-old Lottie Fenn, cast out and alone in the Arizona Territory of 1882, the answer came in the form of a condemned saloon, bought for $2 and the laughter of the entire town. It was a place sealed by blood and memory, its windows boarded, its door a silent warning. But the truth waiting inside that derelict building was far more valuable and far more dangerous than anyone could have imagined. A secret bricked up and forgotten. A secret that would rewrite the history of a town built on lies. Settle in and let us know where you're watching from, because this is a story about how the deepest truths are often found in the most forsaken places. Lottie Fenn arrived in Prescott with everything she owned in a single carpet bag, and the dust of the Verde Valley staining the hem of her dress. The stagecoach left her in the center of town, a churning street of false-fronted buildings, where the air tasted of grit and mulehide. She felt the eyes of men on her, appraising, dismissing. She was young, alone, and carried the quiet shame of being put out. Her former employer, a rancher named Abernathy with a fat belly and wandering hands, had given her an ultimatum. She had chosen the road. The memory was a fresh bruise, his voice slick with false kindness, turning sharp when she refused him. The door of the bunkhouse shutting behind her for the last time. The long walk to the stage stop with his wife's pitying stare following her down the lane. She had worked for them for a year, saving every spare penny, dreaming of buying a small plot of land, a piece of the world that could not be taken from her. Now her savings felt impossibly small, a handful of coins against the vast, indifferent landscape. She carried a deeper loss, too, one that had defined her entire life. Her father, a prospector named Thomas Fenn, had been gone for 5 years, lost in a cave-in at the Lucky 7 mine. She remembered his hands, calloused and kind, the smell of pine and earth on his clothes. He had been a quiet man who believed in the honesty of rock and the promise buried within it. His death had left her adrift, a grief so constant it had become a part of her breathing. Prescott was his last known town, the place he'd sent his final letter from, full of hope about a new claim. Coming here was a pilgrimage of sorts, a way to be close to the last place he had been whole. She found a room at a boarding house run by a stern-faced woman who asked no questions, so long as the rent was paid in advance. For 2 days, Lottie walked the town, listening more than she spoke. She heard the name of Marshall Brody spoken in low, careful tones. She saw the swagger of the men from the Consolidated Mining Company, their pockets heavy with company script. And she saw the saloon. It stood at the edge of the respectable part of town, a sagging, derelict structure hunched between a blacksmith and an empty lot. Its name, the Gilded Cage, was barely visible on a faded sign that swung from a single rusty hinge. The windows were boarded over with weathered planks, and a notice of condemnation from the territorial government was nailed to the door, yellowed and peeling. The townsfolk gave it a wide berth, their gazes skittering away from it as if it held a contagion. Lottie asked the clerk at the land office about it, a young man with ink stains on his fingers. That place? He'd scoffed, not bothering to look up from his ledger. The old Blackwood place. Been shut for years. Marshall Brody closed it down himself after Blackwood and a drifter killed each other over a card game. Place is a mess. Blood on the floorboards they could never scrub out. Condemned. Lottie felt a strange pull, a kinship with the abandoned building. It was an outcast, just like her. Is it for sale? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. The clerk finally looked at her, a smirk playing on his lips. The town owns it for back taxes. They'd probably pay you to take it." He laughed, a short, sharp bark. "But you can have it for the debt. $2. It was a joke, a taunt. $2 was an insult. It was the price of a thing so worthless it couldn't even be given away. Lottie reached into her reticule, her fingers closing around the few coins she had left. She placed $2 silver on the counter. The clerk's smirk vanished, replaced by disbelief. "You're serious?" She met his gaze, her own steady and clear. "I am." He drew up the deed with a theatrical flourish, his pen scratching loudly in the quiet office. As he handed her the paper, he shook his head. "Good luck, miss. You'll need it." Lottie folded the deed and placed it in her bag. She owned something, a broken, blood-stained, forgotten something. But it was hers. Walking out into the harsh sunlight, she felt a sliver of something that had been absent for 5 years. The faintest glimmer of a future. The saloon was hers. The whispers followed her down the plank sidewalk like stray dogs. She felt them more than heard them, a current of disbelief and mockery that parted the air around her. "Bought the old Blackwood place," a woman murmured behind her hand at the general store. "That young thing? All by her lonesome?" A man leaning against a post spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. "More fool her. That place is haunted by bad luck and worse men." Lottie ignored them. She had been the subject of whispers before. They were just noise, like the ceaseless wind that swept through the high desert. She spent her last few coins on a heavy pry bar, a bucket, and a block of lye soap. Practical things. Things with weight and purpose. She walked to the saloon, the deed a small, stiff rectangle in her pocket. The condemned notice on the door was brittle. She tore it off, the paper crumbling in her hand. The wood of the door was swollen tight in its frame. She put her shoulder into it, then again, grunting with the effort. It wouldn't budge. She was about to use the pry bar when a voice, dry as a riverbed in August, spoke from behind her. "That door ain't been opened by man nor beast in 5 years. It's forgotten how." Lottie turned. An old Apache woman sat on a crate in the shade of the blacksmith's awning, a bundle of dried herbs in her lap. Her face was a beautiful map of wrinkles, her eyes dark and knowing. The townsfolk seemed to ignore her, another fixture they had learned not to see. Lottie had noticed her before, a silent observer on the edge of things. The woman's name, she'd heard someone say, was Ilara. Ilara looked from Lottie to the defiant door. "Some doors are sealed to keep trouble out," she said, her voice low and even. "Others are sealed to keep truth in." She held Lottie's gaze for a long moment, an unspoken message passing between them. Then she looked back at her herbs, her part in the conversation apparently over. Lottie pondered the woman's words. Truth. What truth could be in a place like this, other than the simple, brutal truth of a violent end? She turned back to the door, this time examining the frame. Using the tip of the pry bar, she worked it into the gap, leveraging her slight weight against it. The wood groaned, a long, mournful sound of surrender. With a final cracking pop, the door swung inward into a square of absolute darkness. The air that rushed out was stale and thick, smelling of sour whiskey, old dust, and something else. A faint, metallic tang she couldn't place. It smelled of regret. She stood on the threshold, letting her eyes adjust. What had she done? What madness had led her to trade her last dollars for this tomb? Was this just another mistake in a long line of them? Perhaps the whole town was right to laugh. But what other choice did she have? What secret could possibly be worth this ruin? Let us know what you think Lottie should do next in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories like this. For now, Lottie took a deep breath of the dusty, forgotten air and stepped across the threshold into the darkness that was now hers. The first voice of open mockery belonged to Marshall Brody. He found her the next morning as she was wrestling with the first of the boards over the front window. He was a big man, made bigger by the authority of the badge pinned to his chest and the Colt revolver that sat low on his hip. He moved with the slow, deliberate confidence of a man who had never been successfully challenged. He stopped a few feet away, hooking his thumbs in his belt, a condescending smile playing on his lips. "Well, well," he boomed, his voice carrying down the street. "Heard the town had a new fool. Didn't figure it'd be a slip of a girl." Lottie didn't stop her work. She jammed the pry bar under the edge of the plank and threw her weight against it. The nails shrieked but held fast. "This is private property, Marshall," she said, not looking at him. Her voice was even, betraying none of the fear that coiled in her stomach. Brody chuckled, a low, unpleasant sound. "Private property? This is a public hazard, is what it is. I condemned it myself. Should have burned it down, but the town council is soft." He took a step closer, his shadow falling over her. Blackwood was a troublemaker. Got what was coming to him. This place, it holds on to things like that. Bad feelings. You'd be smart to walk away from it. Sell the deed back to the town for $1. Cut your losses. His concern was false, a thin veneer over something else, a possessiveness, as if he had a claim on the building's ruin. "I paid $2, Lottie said, giving the pry bar another heave. A nail groaned and popped free. "I expect to get my money's worth." "Your money's worth?" He laughed out loud now, a full-throated sound of derision that drew the attention of a few passers-by. "Honey, all you bought is a pile of rotten wood and ghosts. You listen to me. There's nothing for you in there." His eyes, small and hard, scanned the decaying facade of the building. Nothing at all. He lingered for another moment, as if waiting for her to break, to falter. When she simply reset her grip on the pry bar, he shook his head in theatrical pity and turned away. "Don't say I didn't warn you," he called over his shoulder as he sauntered off. The warning hung in the air, heavier than the morning heat. It wasn't a friendly piece of advice. It was an order disguised as one. That evening, Silas, the owner of the livery stable, stopped by. He was a quiet, weathered man who had known her father slightly, and he was the only person in town who had offered a kind word. He'd seen her struggling with the boards and had come with a heavy mallet and a longer crowbar. He didn't speak of the marshal or the town's gossip. He just handed her the tools. "Thomas was a good man," Silas said, his gaze fixed on the saloon. "Worked hard. He talked about you. Said you had his same stubborn spine." He looked at her, his eyes kind. "If you need a hot meal, my wife always makes too much." Lottie felt a knot of emotion tighten in her throat. "Thank you, Silas." "Don't thank me," he grunted, turning to leave. "Just be careful. This town has long memories, and some of them are best left undisturbed." His words, so different in tone from the marshal's, carried their own weight. He wasn't warning her away. He was warning her to be watchful. As dusk settled, painting the sky in shades of bruised purple and soft orange, Lottie finally pulled the last board from the first window. A rectangle of fading light fell into the saloon, illuminating a world of dust motes dancing in the air. The warning from the marshal and the quiet caution from Silas circled in her mind, two opposing forces. One sought to drive her away with contempt, the other to keep her safe with care. And then she remembered the old Apache woman's words. Some doors are sealed to keep truth in. A chill, unrelated to the evening air, traced a path down her spine. A truth. What truth could Marshall Brody possibly want to keep buried in a place like this? With a new sense of purpose, Lottie took a lantern and stepped back inside, the darkness no longer just an absence of light, but a vessel for a secret. The beam from her lantern cut a shaky circle through the gloom, revealing the full scope of the saloon's decay. The air was a physical presence, thick with the ghosts of spilled liquor and cold cigar smoke. A fine layer of dust, as pale as ash, coated everything, softening the sharp edges of the ruin. Overturned tables and broken chairs lay scattered across the floor, like the aftermath of a sudden, violent storm. Shards of glass from shattered bottles and mirrors crunched under her boots. It was a place where all sound had died. Her light found the bar first. It was a magnificent wreck, a long, dark slash of mahogany. Its surface was scarred with knife marks and the dark rings of countless glasses. A section of it was splintered and broken where a body, or perhaps just a fist, had crashed through it. Behind the bar, shelves lay in a tangled heap on the floor. The great mirror that should have been there was a spiderweb of cracks, its silvered surface clouded and blind. Lottie set her lantern down on a relatively stable portion of the bar, the small flame pushing the oppressive darkness back a few feet. She had decided to sleep here, in her own property. She didn't have the money for another week at the boarding house. And more than that, she felt a need to claim the space, to inhabit it and make it hers through sheer presence. Her bedroll, laid out in the cleanest corner she could find, looked small and vulnerable in the vast, haunted room. She ate a dry biscuit and drank from her canteen, the silence of the saloon pressing in on her. Every creak of the old building settling, every skittering sound of a mouse in the walls was magnified. It was easy to believe in ghosts here. She thought of her father, trying to conjure his face, the steady calm in his eyes. He had never been afraid of hard work or dark places. He'd spent half his life underground, reading stories in the rock. He would have looked at this place not as a ruin, but as a project. He would have started with a broom. So she did. She found a worn-out broom in a back storage closet and began to sweep, the rhythmic scrape and whisper of the bristles a comforting, human sound against the profound silence. She worked her way from the back to the front, creating a small island of clean floorboards around her bedroll. The dust she swept up was heavy and dark, mingled with old sawdust and the debris of 100 forgotten nights. As she worked her way toward the front, near the door, her foot scuffed against something. She bent down, holding the lantern closer. Carved into the floorboards, almost invisible under the grime, was a set of initials, T.F. Thomas Fenn. Her breath caught in her chest. It couldn't be a coincidence. Fenn was not an uncommon name. But here, in this place? She traced the letters with her finger. The carving was rough, done with the tip of a knife, the way a man might absent-mindedly mark a spot while waiting. A memory surfaced, sudden and sharp. Her father, sitting on their porch, carving her own initials, L.F., into a piece of scrap wood with his pocket knife. The style was the same, the straight, deep cut of the T, the slight curve of the F. A wave of dizziness washed over her. Her father had been here, in this saloon. This wasn't just a random place he passed through. He had sat here, in this spot, long enough to leave his mark. Why had he never mentioned it? His letters spoke of the mine, the claim, the hard work. They never spoke of saloons or card games. It didn't fit the man she knew. She sat back on her heels, the lantern light flickering across the rough letters. The saloon was no longer just a derelict building she had bought out of desperation. It was now a connection, a final, tangible link to her father. The place held more than just bad memories and old dust. It held a piece of him. That night, she slept deeply, the ghosts of the gilded cage seeming less like a threat and more like silent witnesses. She was no longer just reclaiming a building. She was searching for the ghost of her father. The discovery of his initials changed the nature of her work. It was no longer just about survival, about carving out a space for herself. It became an act of archaeology, a careful excavation of the past. Each shovelful of debris, each piece of broken furniture she cleared, felt like a question she was asking the silent room. What happened here? Why were you in this place, Father? The next morning, she started on the bar. It was the heart of the saloon, the center of the violence that had shut its doors. If there were answers to be found, they would be near it. The structure was too heavy to move, so she began by clearing the wreckage around and behind it. She filled her bucket with shattered glass, splintered wood, and unrecognizable bits of rusted metal, carrying load after load out to a heap in the back alley. The work was slow and grueling. Her hands, already calloused, began to blister. Her back ached, but the physical labor was a balm. It quieted the noise in her head, focusing her mind on the simple, honest reality of the task in front of her. As she cleared the debris from behind the bar, she began to notice something odd about the wall. Most of the saloon's interior was rough-hewn planks, but this back wall was made of brick, a chimney stack at one end. Yet the section directly behind the center of the bar was different. The bricks were a slightly different shade of red, a bit newer, less weathered than the rest. The mortar was paler, a sandy beige that stood out from the crumbling, soot-stained gray of the surrounding joints. It was a patch, a clumsy, hasty one. It wasn't flush with the rest of the wall. It bulged out almost imperceptibly, a shallow curve in the flat surface. Lottie ran her hand over it. The bricks felt solid, immovable. It could be a simple repair, damage from the brawl that had closed the place. A man thrown against the wall, a few bricks knocked loose and replaced. That was the logical explanation. But it didn't feel right. Her father had taught her to look for the thing that was out of place, the seam in the rock that signaled a hidden vein of ore. This wall was a seam. The memory of Ilara's words returned. Some doors are sealed to keep truth in. This wasn't a repair. It felt like a seal. It was too deliberate, too large. The patch was nearly 6 feet high and 4 feet wide. Who would re-brick an entire section of wall for a minor repair? She set the thought aside for the moment, telling herself she was imagining things, letting the strangeness of the place get to her. She continued her work, focusing on tearing out the most damaged sections of the mahogany bar top, prying up the splintered wood to see what the foundation beneath was like. But her eyes kept drifting back to the brick wall. The color difference seemed more pronounced in the shifting light of the afternoon. The bulge seemed to mock her, a silent, stony secret. That evening, after a simple meal, she didn't unroll her bedding. Instead, she took her lantern and a small hammer she'd found and approached the wall. She tapped one of the bricks in the center of the patch. It gave a dull, solid thud. She tapped a brick on the older part of the wall. The sound was deeper, more resonant, with a faint echo. There was a space behind the new bricks, a hollow space. A cold certainty settled in her stomach. This was not a patch. It was a doorway, a hidden one. She did not act on it that night. The discovery was too large, the implications too unnerving. She needed to live with it, to let the reality of it settle. She laid out her bedroll, but sleep did not come easily. The saloon was no longer just a place of memory. It was a place of secrets, and she felt the weight of them pressing down in the darkness, waiting for her to find the courage to bring them into the light. The next day, she bought a heavy sledgehammer and a cold chisel from the blacksmith, spending the last of her savings. The blacksmith, a burly man with soot on his face, gave her a curious look. "Tearing something down or building something up?" he asked. "A bit of both, I think," Lottie replied. The weight of the hammer in her hands was both terrifying and empowering. This was an act of violation, of breaking and entering into the saloon's sealed past. She stood before the wall for a long time, the silence of the room amplifying the frantic beat of her own heart. This was the point of no return. Whatever lay behind this wall, Blackwood or someone else, had not wanted it found. Marshall Brody's warning echoed in her mind. "There's nothing for you in there." Had he known about this? Was this the nothing he was so eager for her to ignore? Lottie took a deep breath, gripped the sledgehammer, and swung. The first blow was clumsy, striking the mortar joint with a jarring crack that sent a puff of pale dust into the air. The brick held. She swung again, harder this time, putting her back and her grief and her anger into it. The hammer hit the center of a brick with a satisfying crunch. A spiderweb of cracks appeared. The third swing shattered the brick, revealing not wood or earth, but a dark, empty space behind it. A pocket of stale, trapped air sighed out, carrying a faint scent of paper and dry leather. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She was right. It was a room. She worked methodically now, using the chisel and a smaller hammer to chip away at the mortar, loosening the surrounding bricks one by one. Each brick she removed widened the hole, letting more light into the hidden space. It was slow, painstaking work. The mortar was stubborn, and her arms ached with the strain. Sawdust and grit filled the air, coating her face and hair. She worked for hours, losing track of time, focused only on the task. The sun moved across the sky, its beams slanting through the dusty windows, illuminating her solitary labor. Finally, the opening was large enough to squeeze through. She peered inside, holding her lantern ahead of her. It was a small, windowless room, no bigger than a pantry. It was an office. A desk and a single chair stood against the far wall. A small, cast-iron safe was tucked into the corner, and papers. Papers were everywhere, stacked on the desk, spilling from open drawers, scattered on the floor, as if left in a great hurry. The room was a perfectly preserved moment in time, sealed away from the dust and decay of the saloon outside. Lottie squeezed through the opening, her boots landing softly on the floorboards. She raised the lantern high. The beam fell across a ledger lying open on the desk. She stepped closer, her eyes scanning the neat columns of names and figures. The names were a roll call of the most powerful men in Prescott. The mine foreman from Consolidated, the owner of the general store, the land agent. And next to each name, a date and a sum of money. The last entry was for Marshall Brody. The sum beside his name was the largest. It was a book of bribes. Her hand trembled as she turned a page. Tucked into the ledger was a sheaf of letters, written in a cramped, angry hand. She recognized the signature at the bottom of the one on top. Silas Blackwood, the saloon's former owner. She began to read. Brody promises the claim will be ours once Fenn and McGregor are out of the way. He says a cave-in is the cleanest way. No questions asked. The assay report shows they were sitting on the mother lode, and the marshal wants his cut for making it disappear. The lantern slipped in her grasp, the room tilting around her. Fenn, her father, Thomas Fenn. It wasn't a cave-in. It wasn't an accident. It was murder. She sank into the dusty chair, the letter shaking in her hand. She read on, her vision blurring with tears. The letters laid it all out. A conspiracy between Marshal Brody, the Consolidated Mine foreman, and Silas Blackwood to steal her father's claim. Her father and his partner, a man named McGregor, had filed a claim on a small, independent plot that turned out to be richer than anyone knew. The company wanted it, and Brody was their instrument. Blackwood was the go-between, the one who handled the payments and kept the records. But the last letter revealed a falling out. Blackwood was demanding a larger share, threatening to expose the whole thing. The letter was dated the day before the brawl that had killed him. The fight hadn't been over a card game. It had been an execution. The drifter was likely an assassin sent by Brody to silence Blackwood and seal this room forever. She looked at the small iron safe in the corner. If the letters were here, what was in there? It took her the rest of the day to find the combination, hidden cleverly on the spine of a book on the desk. When the heavy door finally swung open, it revealed stacks of gold certificates and, tucked in the back, 2 official-looking documents. They were the original assay reports and the deed to her father's claim, the Lucky 7, signed over to the Consolidated Mining Company 2 days after his supposed death. The signature was a forgery. Lottie sat on the floor of the hidden room, surrounded by the evidence of her father's murder and the theft of his legacy. The grief was a physical blow, a fresh agony that stole her breath. But beneath the grief, a cold, hard anger began to form. They had not just killed her father. They had erased him, turning his life's work into a lie. They had left her an orphan, penniless and alone, while they grew rich on his discovery. The town that had mocked her, the marshal who had warned her away, they were all complicit, either through corruption or ignorance. The saloon was no longer a shelter. It was a tomb, and she had just unearthed its secrets. And now she knew she had to be its voice. A storm was coming. Lottie could feel it in the air, a restless energy that made the dust devils dance in the street and the old saloon timbers groan. It mirrored the tempest inside her. She spent the night in the hidden office, the letters and deeds spread before her on the desk, the lantern casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. She did not sleep. She read and reread, committing every word, every name, every date to memory. The story they told was so monstrous, so complete in its villainy, that it felt like something from a penny dreadful. But this was real. This was her father's life, and his death. By dawn, the anger had burned away the fear, leaving behind a cold, clear resolve. She knew what she had to do, but she also knew she couldn't simply walk to the nearest authority. The highest authority in Prescott was Marshal Brody, the man at the center of the conspiracy. She was a 19-year-old girl with no standing and no allies against the most powerful man in town. Presenting this evidence would be signing her own death warrant. The sky outside had turned a bruised, greenish yellow. The wind was picking up, howling around the corners of the saloon. As she was bundling the papers into her carpet bag, she heard a frantic pounding on the front door. She froze, her heart leaping into her throat. Had Brody found out? Was he here already? "Hello? Please, is anyone in there?" The voice was a woman's, thin with panic. Lottie crept to the door, peering through a crack in the wood. A family, a man, a pregnant woman, and a small child, were huddled on the porch, their wagon and horses looking panicked in the street. "The storm!" the man shouted over the wind. "It came up so fast. The livery is full. Please, can we just shelter in here?" Lottie looked at their desperate faces. Helping them meant revealing herself, revealing that the saloon was occupied. But turning them away in a storm like this, it wasn't something she could do. It wasn't something her father would have done. She unbarred the door and let them in, just as the first heavy drops of rain began to fall. They stumbled inside, shaking and grateful, their eyes wide at the ruin within. "Thank you, miss," the woman said, clutching her belly. "We're the Millers, heading to California." Just then, the saloon door was thrust open again with a bang. Marshal Brody stood on the threshold, rain plastering his hair to his forehead, his face a mask of thunder. He wasn't looking at the Millers. His eyes were fixed on the opening in the brick wall, the pile of rubble and the faint lantern glow from within. He knew. "I warned you," he said, his voice a low growl. He took a step inside, his hand resting on the butt of his gun. "I told you to leave this place alone." The Millers shrank back, terrified. Lottie moved to stand between Brody and the hole in the wall, her small frame the only barrier to the secrets in that room. Her carpet bag, containing the evidence, was on the floor just behind her. "This is my property, Marshal," she said, her voice shaking but firm. "You're trespassing." "Your property?" He laughed, a harsh, ugly sound that was swallowed by a clap of thunder. "You own nothing. Blackwood owned nothing. This all belongs to the company." He took another step, his eyes glinting in the dim light. "Now, you're going to be a good little girl and hand over whatever you found in there. We can forget this whole thing. You can walk away." The wind shrieked, and the rain began to fall in sheets, drumming on the roof like a frantic heartbeat. This was the test, the moment of choice. She could give him the papers, save herself, and let her father's murder remain a secret forever. Or she could fight. She thought of her father's honest hands, of the initials carved in the floor, of the life he never got to live. "No," she said. The word was quiet, but it filled the space between them. Brody's face hardened. He drew his gun. "I won't ask again." Suddenly, the side door that led to the alley burst open. Silas, the livery owner, stood there, a shotgun held steady in his hands. "I think you should be on your way, Marshal," Silas said, his voice calm but unyielding. "This young lady is under my protection, and it seems she has guests." Brody was caught, his fury warring with the cold reality of the shotgun and the three witnesses cowering by the wall. To shoot Lottie now would be an act of open murder, not something that could be easily explained away. He glared at Lottie, his eyes burning with a promise of future retribution. "This isn't over," he spat. Then he turned and strode out into the raging storm, slamming the door behind him. The crisis had passed, but Lottie knew the real storm was just beginning. She had survived the confrontation, but now she had to win the war. The storm broke by morning, leaving the air washed clean and the dust settled. The Miller family, their fear replaced by a quiet awe, left soon after, promising to tell anyone who would listen what they had seen. Silas stayed. He looked from Lottie to the gaping hole in the wall, then back to her face, which was pale but resolute. "Your father," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "He came to me the week before the accident. He said he was on to something big, He was worried. Said if anything happened to him, I should. But he never finished. Never told me what to do. Silas shook his head, a deep regret in his eyes. I should have pressed him. I'm sorry, Lottie. You're here now, Silas, she said, and that was enough. They knew they couldn't stay in Prescott. Brody was humiliated, and a man like that was more dangerous than ever. He wouldn't risk another public confrontation, but an accident in a dark alley, a fire in the night, those were his specialties. The nearest place with any real authority was Phoenix, the territorial capital. It was a 2-day ride. Silas arranged for a sturdy wagon and a pair of mules. While he was gone, Lottie went back into the hidden office and gathered every last scrap of paper, every ledger, every letter. She wrapped them in oilcloth and secured them in her carpet bag. As she worked, an idea began to form, a way to protect not just the evidence, but the truth itself. Before they left, under the cover of the pre-dawn gray, Lottie did one last thing. With a bucket of whitewash borrowed from Silas, she painted a single large word across the boarded-up front of the gilded cage. Truth. The journey to Phoenix was tense. Every rider on the horizon, every shadow on the trail, seemed like a threat. Silas drove the wagon, his shotgun always within reach, while Lottie sat beside him, the carpet bag clutched in her lap. They spoke little, the weight of their purpose creating its own silent language. When they arrived, they didn't go to the local law. They went straight to the offices of the territorial circuit judge, a man named Elias Thorne, known for his stern demeanor and incorruptible reputation. The clerk tried to turn them away, but Lottie's quiet insistence, the mention of Marshall Brody and Consolidated Mining, finally earned them a brief audience. Judge Thorne was a formidable man with eyes that seemed to see right through to a person's intentions. He listened without interruption as Lottie, her voice clear and steady, laid out the entire story. She didn't embellish or plead. She simply told the facts, presenting the letters, the ledger, and the forged deed one by one. She placed the original assay report on his desk last. The judge picked it up, his face impassive. He read it, then read it again. He held it to the light, examining the watermark, the signature, the seal. He was a kind professional, his competence a quiet, reassuring force. He looked from the report to Lottie. "This is your father's hand?" he asked, pointing to Thomas Fenn's signature on the original claim filing. "Yes, sir," Lottie said. He then picked up the deed that signed the claim over to Consolidated. "And this?" "No, sir. That is not his hand." The judge was silent for a long time, his steepled fingers hiding his mouth. The entire future hinged on his next words. Finally, he lowered his hands. "A U.S. Marshal will be dispatched to Prescott by week's end," he said, his voice ringing with quiet authority. "They will take Marshal Brody and the mine foreman into custody. Warrants will be issued for the others. The consolidated claim on the Lucky 7 mine is hereby frozen pending a federal investigation." It was over. Just like that. The vindication was so sudden, so complete, that Lottie felt lightheaded. As they were leaving, Judge Thorne stopped her. "Miss Fenn," he said, his stern face softening for the first time. "What you have done, it required a great deal of courage. Your father would be proud." News traveled fast in the territory. By the time Lottie and Silas returned to Prescott a week later, the town was transformed. The U.S. Marshals had already come and gone, taking a sullen and defeated Brody with them. The mine foreman was in custody, and the other men named in Blackwood's ledger were in a state of panic. The townspeople who had once mocked her now watched her with a mixture of awe and respect. The word painted on her saloon had become a landmark. People would stop and look at it, speaking in hushed tones. Truth. Lottie had done more than uncover a crime. She had given the town its history back, exposing the rot at its foundation. The story of the girl who bought a condemned saloon for $2 and brought down the most powerful men in the region was already becoming a legend. The change in the town was palpable. The fear that had been a constant undercurrent was gone, replaced by a cautious optimism. Families who had been cheated by Consolidated began to speak to lawyers. Other prospectors felt emboldened to re-examine old claims. Lottie's single act of courage had created a ripple of justice. The Millers, the family she had sheltered, had reached a town down the line and told their story to a reporter for a territorial newspaper. The article, headlined "The Angel of Prescott and the Devil's Due," painted Lottie as a hero, and people began to arrive in town just to see the saloon and the young woman who had uncovered its secrets. Lottie, however, wanted no part of the legend. She deflected the praise and focused on her work, with the gold certificates from the safe, now legally hers as her father's heir. She had the means to properly restore the saloon. She hired Silas to oversee the work, and slowly the gilded cage began to shed its skin of ruin and neglect. She had the main room cleared and cleaned, the broken furniture replaced, the scarred bar sanded down and refinished until the mahogany glowed once more. She replaced the shattered mirror with a new, clear one, but she left the hole in the brick wall, framing it neatly. She turned the hidden office into a small private dining room, a quiet memorial to the truth it had held. She decided not to reopen it as a saloon. The name, the Gilded Cage, felt wrong now. It was a name from the past, a past of corruption and violence. The building was something else now, something more. It was a place of reckoning. One evening, as the sun was setting, casting a warm, golden light over the dusty street, Lottie stood in the doorway of the restored building. The air was cool and smelled of new pine and varnish. Silas walked up, wiping his hands on a rag. He looked at the clean lines of the building, the new glass in the windows, the steady lamplight glowing from within. "It's a fine place now, Lottie," he said. "What are you going to call it?" Lottie looked out at the town, at the people walking by who now nodded at her with genuine respect. She thought of her father, of the long journey that had brought her here, of the ruin she had purchased, and the truth she had found within it. She had come to Prescott seeking a connection to her father's memory, and had ended up restoring his legacy. She hadn't just cleaned up a building, she had built a foundation. "I think," she said softly, her voice carrying the quiet moral of her entire journey, "I'll call it the Founder's House. Thank you for staying with us to the end of this incredible story. It's a powerful reminder that sometimes the greatest value is hidden right beneath the surface, waiting for someone with the patience to find it." If you were moved by Lottie's journey, please give this video a like and let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe for more tales of hidden history and unexpected triumph. We'll see you next time. What would you do if all you had left in the world was a single silver dollar and a grief too heavy to carry alone? What if the only thing for sale was a ghost, a mountain of rust half swallowed by a river that had already taken everything from you? For 18-year-old Cora Jessup, standing on the muddy banks of the Mississippi in the autumn of 1887, this wasn't a question. It was the last, desperate line of a story she felt was already over. She had just bought a derelict steamship for $1, a vessel the world had condemned as scrap. But the truth waiting inside its sealed heart, a truth guarded by 2 decades of silence and rust, would not just give her a future. It would reclaim a past she never knew she had lost. Settle in, and let us tell you a story about the things we throw away, and the quiet souls brave enough to find their value. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from, as we journey back to a forgotten bend in the river. The air south of Memphis hung thick and damp, smelling of silt and decay. Cora stood beside the borrowed wagon, her hand resting on the warm, worn flank of the horse that had carried her away from the only life she'd known. Behind her lay the city, and in it, the gray stone walls of the orphanage that had been her home for the 6 months since her father's body was pulled from these same waters. He had been a riverman, born to it, and the river had claimed him as its own, leaving her with nothing but a hollowed-out feeling and a single, worn, silver dollar he'd pressed into her palm the last time she saw him. "For luck, Cora girl," he'd murmured, his voice rough as burlap. "Never be without $1 in your pocket." Now it was the only thing in her pocket. Mr. Abernathy, the kindly clerk who had managed her father's meager final affairs, cleared his throat. He was a small man with a face full of worried lines, most of which seemed to be dedicated to her. He had been her father's friend, and in the vacuum of that loss, he had tried to be hers too. It was he who had told her of the government auction of derelict vessels, scrap metal to be cleared from the riverbanks. He saw the flicker of an idea in her eyes, an idea he'd tried to gently talk her out of. But Cora's quiet was a stubborn thing. He had driven her here himself, his own wagon loaded with a small canvas tent, a heavy wool blanket, a cast-iron skillet, and a box of hardtack and dried beans, a meager arsenal against the wilderness. "It's not too late, Cora," he said, his voice soft. "There are positions in the city, a seamstress, a laundress, honest work." She shook her head, her eyes fixed on the shoreline ahead. There, like the skeletons of great beasts, lay the rusted husks of a dozen steamships. They listed in the mud, their smokestacks tilted at weary angles, their paddle wheels broken and tangled in willow roots. They were monuments to failure, to storms and snags and the slow, grinding victory of the river. One of them was about to be hers. She turned to the old clerk, her gaze direct and clear. "He taught me the river, Mr. Abernathy. Said you have to respect it, but you can't ever fear it." She reached into her worn dress pocket, and her fingers closed around the cool metal of the dollar. It felt heavier than a coin. It felt like a promise. "Thank you for the ride, and for the supplies." He saw the finality in her face, and his shoulders slumped. He helped her unload the gear, his movements slow and sad. As the sun began to dip below the tree line on the far bank, casting the wrecks in long, distorted shadows, he climbed back onto his wagon. "I'll come check on you in a week's time," he called out. Not a question, but a statement. Cora just nodded, watching the wagon creak away until it was lost to the dusk, leaving her alone with the groaning of the metal and the whisper of the water. The auction the next morning was a grim, hurried affair held under a sky the color of dishwater. A handful of men stood around a fast-talking auctioneer, their faces hard with calculation. They were scrap dealers, mostly, men who saw the dead ships not as history, but as tonnage, their value measured in pennies per pound. And then there was Silas Croft. He was a landowner, a man whose wealth was new enough that he wore it like an ill-fitting suit, all arrogance and swagger. He owned much of the cleared land bordering this stretch of the river, and made it known he considered the wrecks an eyesore on his domain. The auctioneer rattled through the lots, his voice a flat monotone. Ships were sold for $10, $15, $20, their value stripped down to the raw material of their defeat. Finally, he pointed a dismissive thumb over his shoulder. Lot 12, the Morning Glory, side-wheeler, beached in the storm of '64. Hull compromised, engines seized, half filled with silt. We'll start the bidding at $1. A thick silence fell, broken only by the cawing of a crow. Croft let out a short, barking laugh. $1 for that pile of rust? I'll pay $1 to have it hauled away. The other men grinned. The auctioneer's eyes scanned the small crowd, impatient. $1? Do I hear $1? From the back of the group, a quiet voice spoke. $1. All heads turned. Cora stood with her chin held high, her hand raised almost imperceptibly. Croft stared at her, his lips curled in a sneer of disbelief. "Well, I'll be," he drawled, loud enough for everyone to hear. "What's a slip of a girl gonna do with a heap of rust?" The auctioneer, caring only for the completion of his list, didn't wait for another bid. "Sold!" he cried, banging a small wooden gavel against his palm. "For $1, to the girl." The bill of sale was a simple, grimy piece of paper. As Cora folded it and tucked it away, Croft approached her, his shadow falling over her. "You got spirit, I'll give you that," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "But that boat's a coffin? Make a fine one for you, I suppose? Quicker than the river, at least." Cora met his gaze and said nothing. Her silence was a wall he couldn't seem to breach. He grunted and turned away, leaving her to her purchase. She walked toward it, her boots sinking into the soft mud. The Morning Glory was the largest of the wrecks, a once proud vessel now listing hard to port, its single remaining paddle wheel caught in a web of roots and vines. Up close, the scale of the ruin was overwhelming. Rust flaked off in sheets the size of dinner plates. The wood of the upper decks was blackened and splintered. The name, painted in faded gold letters on the prow, was barely legible, ghosted by time and weather. It seemed an impossible task, a fool's errand. This was her inheritance, a mountain of iron and sorrow. Why would an orphaned girl spend her last dollar on a sunken wreck? What secret could possibly be worth more than a life of security? We think we know, but the truth is always buried deeper than we imagine. Let us know in the comments what you think she'll find, and be sure to subscribe for more stories of impossible hope. Now, as the last light faded, Cora Jessup stood before her inheritance, and the river whispered its first welcome. The first days were a lesson in sheer survival. Cora set up her small canvas tent on a patch of high ground, 100 yards from the Morning Glory. She learned the landscape not as scenery, but as a larder and a threat. She found a clear, cold spring seeping from a rock face, gathered fallen branches for her fire, and used the snares her father had taught her to make to catch a pair of rabbits. With the few coins Mr. Abernathy had pressed on her, she walked the 2 miles to the nearest settlement, a dusty crossroads called Haven's Landing, to buy salt, flour, and a small sack of oats. It was there the whispers began. The townspeople watched her from the corners of their eyes. A girl, alone, living in a tent by the ship graveyard. They saw a fool or a lunatic. Children pointed, and their mothers pulled them away. The men at the general store took to calling her the Rust Queen, or more cruelly, Captain Cora. Silas Croft made a point of riding his fine black horse along the river path every other day, reining in just close enough for his laughter to carry across the water to her camp. He never spoke to her directly again, but his message was clear. He was waiting for her to fail. She ignored him, and she ignored the whispers. Her focus narrowed to the work. To get to the ship, she needed to haul supplies, and for that, she needed more than her own 2 hands. In Haven's Landing, tied behind the blacksmith's shop, was an old sway-backed mule with 1 floppy ear and a coat the color of dust. The smith wanted $5 for him. Cora had 2, which she'd earned by mending a fisherman's nets. She offered the $2 and a promise to muck out his stable for a month. The smith, a man with more pragmatism than sentiment, agreed. The mule was old and stubborn, but his eyes were patient. Cora named him Patience. He became her silent, steadfast companion, standing watch on the shore as she worked, his presence a quiet reassurance in the vast loneliness of the riverbank. One evening, as twilight bled purple and orange across the sky, a figure emerged from the dense woods that bordered the river. It was an old woman, her face a beautiful map of wrinkles, her hair in 2 long silver braids. She moved with a slow, deliberate grace, carrying a basket woven from river cane. Cora had seen her before, foraging along the water's edge. The townspeople said she was Choctaw, one of the few who had remained, living as her people always had. The woman stopped near Cora's fire, her dark eyes moving from the girl to the hulking shadow of the morning glory. Cora tensed, but the woman's presence held no threat. After a long moment of silence, the woman spoke. Her voice low and raspy, like dry leaves skittering over stone. "Some things are not lost," she said, her gaze fixed on the rusted ship. "They only wait for the right hands to find them." Without another word, she turned and melted back into the growing darkness of the woods. Cora sat by her fire for a long time, the old woman's words echoing in her mind. She didn't understand what they meant, but they felt like a key, a piece of a puzzle she hadn't even known she was trying to solve. The weight of that cryptic sentence was a strange comfort, a small point of light in the vast, enveloping darkness. Cora knew she couldn't understand the ship from the shore. She had to get inside, to walk its decks and learn its bones. The physical journey began with a single, treacherous step. The gangplank had rotted away decades ago. She found a pair of long, sturdy logs and, with Patience's help, dragged them into the sucking mud, bracing them against the ship's listing hull to form a crude ramp to the main cargo deck. The deck itself was a death trap. Planks, softened to the consistency of wet bread, crumbled under her weight. Rusted metal snagged at her dress and boots. She spent a week doing nothing but clearing a path, prying up rotten boards and tossing them into the river, testing each step before putting her full weight down. She worked from dawn until her back ached and her hands were raw, clearing a safe walkway from her ramp to the main companionway that led to the upper decks and the cabins. Then the weather turned. A cold, steady rain began to fall. Not a storm, but a persistent, miserable drizzle that promised to last for days. It soaked her to the bone, turned the riverbank into a slick, greedy mire, and transformed the inside of her tent into a damp, chilly cave. The ship itself seemed to mourn in the rain. Rust-colored water wept from its seams, trickling down the hull in long, sorrowful streaks. The wind, funneled between the wrecks, moaned through broken windows and rotted doorways. The world shrank to the gray sky, the gray water, and the gray despair that began to seep into Cora's resolve. After days of waiting for a break in the weather that never came, she decided she could wait no longer. Wrapping herself in a piece of oiled canvas, she made her way across the slick logs and onto the deck. The door to the grand salon was swollen shut. She put her shoulder into it again and again until the wood splintered and the door groaned open. The sight inside almost broke her spirit. This had once been a place of splendor. Now it was a waterlogged tomb. Remnants of gilded molding hung in peeling strips from the ceiling. Velvet upholstery on the banquettes had dissolved into clumps of green and black mold. A grand piano stood against one wall, its veneer cracked and warped, its ivory keys swollen and silent, like a mouth frozen mid-scream. The ruin was absolute. It confirmed every jeering word from Silas Croft, every pitying glance from the townspeople. It was worthless. That night, huddled in her damp blanket, Cora felt the full weight of her decision. The rain drummed a relentless rhythm on the canvas of her tent. The morning glory groaned in the dark, the sound of a dying thing settling into its grave. She had traded her last dollar, her last connection to her father, for a pile of rot and rust. Despair, cold and heavy as riverstone, settled in her heart. She was a fool, an orphan and a fool, alone in the dark. She fell into a fitful sleep, haunted by dreams of her father's face, swirling in dark water. Sometime deep in the night, she was startled awake. The rain had lessened to a whisper, but another sound had taken its place. A faint, rhythmic tapping. It wasn't the wind, or the drip of water, or the creak of the hull. It was methodical. A quiet, insistent beat coming from somewhere deep within the iron heart of the ship. The sound was a mystery, and mystery was a stronger pull than despair. The next morning, the rain had stopped, leaving the world shrouded in a thick, wet fog. Cora lit her lantern, its small yellow flame a fragile defiance against the grayness, and went back aboard the Morning Glory. The tapping was still there, faint but steady. A knock-knock-knock that seemed to come from below her feet. She followed the sound, her lantern held high. It led her past the ruined salon, down a treacherous, slick companionway ladder into the lower decks. Here the air grew thick and close, heavy with the smell of stagnant water, oil, and 2 decades of decay. The sound grew stronger as she descended. It led her to the engine room. It was a cavern of machinery, a cathedral of iron. The 2 massive pistons, each as tall as a man, stood silent and frozen, coated in a deep orange crust of rust. The great boilers were cold and dark. The tapping seemed to be coming from the wall behind them, from the boiler room itself. But the way was blocked. The door to the boiler room wasn't just locked, it was sealed. A heavy iron plate, a half-inch thick, had been riveted over the entire doorframe, covering it completely. The edges were crudely welded to the bulkhead. This was the anomaly. This was the detail that didn't fit. In a shipwreck, you salvage. You pull out the brass fittings, the copper pipes, anything of value. You don't make a part of the ship more secure. You don't weld a tomb shut. Why would anyone go to such lengths to seal a simple boiler room? As she ran her hand over the cold, rough plate, her fingers traced a set of markings scratched into the metal near the edge. They weren't letters or numbers. They were symbols. A crude starburst next to a crescent moon. A personal sigil scrawled in haste. A memory surfaced. A fragment of a story her father had told her on a warm summer evening long ago, sitting on the porch of their small house. He'd spoken of the war, of the chaos on the river. He'd told her about how some of the Union patrol boats, carrying payrolls or sensitive dispatches, had a last-ditch safe, a captain's hold. It wasn't a separate room, but a small fireproof compartment built directly into the brickwork insulating the boilers, the most protected part of the ship. A place to hide something so valuable you'd sooner sink it than let it be captured. The Morning Glory had run aground in a storm, her father had said. It hadn't been attacked, It hadn't burned or exploded. There would have been time. Time to hide something. Time to seal the door. The seal itself was the clue. It wasn't an act of salvage. It was an act of deliberate, desperate concealment. Her despair from the night before evaporated, replaced by a new, burning curiosity. Whatever was in that room, someone had wanted it to stay there forever. She didn't have the tools to break that seal. Not yet. But as she stood there in the belly of the ship, her hand resting on the cold iron plate, she made a silent promise. She would find a way. The tapping had stopped, but she knew now what it was. The sound of a loose shutter or a piece of metal moved by the wind, knocking against the outer hull right next to the sealed room. It had been a coincidence, a ghost sound, but it had led her here. It had led her to the door. The mission now had a singular focus: breach the boiler room. The work of investigation became the work of pure, brute labor. Cora walked the 2 miles to Haven's Landing and went to the blacksmith's shop. Using the last of the money Mr. Abernathy had given her, she bought a 10-pound sledgehammer, a set of 3 cold chisels, and a long, heavy crowbar. The smith, a burly man with soot ingrained in the lines of his face, looked at the tools, then at her slender frame. "That's a lot of persuasion for a young lady," he grumbled, but he took her money without another word. The labor was the most punishing she had ever known. Each day she would descend into the ship's gut with her lantern and her tools. She started on the welds holding the iron plate. She'd place the tip of a chisel against a seam and swing the sledgehammer. The first blow sent a shock wave up her arms that rattled her teeth. The sound was deafening in the enclosed space, a sharp, ringing crack that echoed through the hull. Patience the mule stood his faithful watch on the riverbank, his one good ear flicking in the direction of the ship with every clang, as if monitoring her progress. The sound became a new rhythm on the river, a declaration of war against the rust and the silence. Day after day, she worked. Her hands, soft from a life of mending and keeping house, blistered on the 2nd day. By the 4th, the blisters had broken, leaving raw, weeping skin. By the end of the week, the skin had begun to harden into calluses. Her shoulders burned, her back screamed, but she did not stop. She learned the metal, its points of weakness, the way it would groan just before a small piece flaked away. She was no longer just a girl. She was a smith, a salvager, a demolitions expert of one. Silas Croft rode by one afternoon, drawn by the incessant ringing. He reined in his horse at the water's edge and watched her, a small figure disappearing into the wreck. "Still at it, girl?" he shouted, his voice thick with amusement. "You'll break your back before you break that boat." Cora heard him, but she didn't pause. She simply repositioned her chisel and swung the hammer again. Clang. Her answer was the work itself. As she toiled, her mind worked over the clues. The ship went down in '64, a Union patrol boat. Her father had said it was caught in a sudden squall while hunting for Confederate raiders known to be operating in the area, sealed in a hurry. What was so important that a captain would choose to entomb it rather than risk it falling into enemy hands? Payroll for Union troops? Dispatches for a general downriver? She worked her way from the welds to the rivets, thick iron studs that held the plate fast to the bulkhead. The first one wouldn't budge. She worked on it for 2 full days, chipping away, finding the angle, learning the precise spot to strike. Then, with a high-pitched screech, it gave, popping loose and clattering to the floor. The small victory felt monumental. She knew how to do it now. Her hands, scarred and stained with rust, were learning the secret the iron held long before her mind could guess it. One rivet, then another. The work was slow, grueling, but it was progress. Near the end of the second week, she managed to drive her crowbar into the gap she'd created. With a final, desperate heave, the top corner of the iron plate began to bend outward, revealing a sliver of profound, silent darkness behind it. With the first breach made, a renewed energy surged through her. She worked the crowbar into the gap, using a broken piece of a piston rod as a fulcrum. She put her entire weight into it, her muscles screaming in protest. There was a low, wrenching groan of tortured metal, a sound that vibrated through the entire hull, and then the plate, with a final, shuddering sigh, tore free from the remaining rivets and crashed to the iron floor with a deafening boom. Dust and rust filled the air. When it settled, the original boiler room door was revealed. Its hinges were fused, its lock a solid block of corrosion. There would be no picking this lock. She turned to her crowbar again, jamming the tip into the seam between the door and the frame. For hours, she worked at it, heaving and resting, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Suddenly, the rusted lock mechanism shattered internally. The door swung inward with a piercing shriek, opening into a blackness so complete it seemed to swallow the light from her lantern. She took a steadying breath and stepped across the threshold. The air inside was still and surprisingly dry, tasting of cold iron and dust. The two great boilers stood like silent iron tombs. And there, against the far wall, built into the heavy brickwork that surrounded the firebox, was another door. Small, square, and made of thick cast iron. A safe. This was it. The captain's hold. The lock on this door was a brass combination dial, its face green with verdigris, its tumblers frozen by time. She wasted no time trying to turn it. Instead, she took up her hammer and a sharp chisel and went to work on the hinges. This was finer work, requiring precision. Blow by blow, she chipped away at the hinge pins. It took the rest of the day and into the night. Finally, with a sharp crack, the last hinge gave way. The heavy iron door fell forward onto the floor. Holding her lantern high, she peered into the small, dark compartment. It was not filled with treasure, not in the way stories would have it. It was a simple, dry space, barely 2 feet square. On a single clean shelf sat 3 items: a cylindrical tin document tube sealed with wax, a heavy leather courier pouch stamped with the seal of the U.S. Army, and a small, heavy iron lockbox. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She reached for the lockbox first. It was heavy, far heavier than its size suggested. The lock was simple, and she broke it easily with the tip of her crowbar. She lifted the lid. Her lantern light glinted on gold. Stacks of coins, neatly wrapped in oilcloth. U.S. gold eagles minted in the 1850s. There must have been 200 of them. A fortune. Enough to leave this riverbank, to start a life anywhere she chose. Her hands shaking, she set the box aside and picked up the tin tube. She broke the brittle wax seal and slid out a roll of papers. They were cotton futures contracts, dozens of them, dated 1863, for thousands of bales from plantations up and down the river. If the claims were still valid, they were worth even more than the gold. Lastly, she reached for the leather pouch. It felt stiff and ancient. The wax seal, bearing the eagle insignia of the Army, was cracked but unbroken. It was addressed to the military governor, Western Tennessee District, Memphis. With a deep breath, she broke the seal and tipped the contents into her hand. There were several pages of official-looking dispatches. But one document on top was different. It was written on heavy parchment, its script formal and precise. She read the words, her lips moving silently. A full and unconditional pardon. For a man named Alistair Finch, convicted of treason against the United States, signed by the military governor, dated May 4th, 1864. She read the name again, the letters seeming to burn in the lantern light. Alistair Finch. That was her mother's maiden name. It was the name of the grandfather she had never met. The lantern flame trembled in her unsteady hand. Alistair Finch, her grandfather, hanged as a Confederate traitor in the summer of '64. That was the great, unspoken shame of her mother's family, a shadow that had followed them even after her mother married and took the Jessup name. Her father had spoken of it only once, in hushed, pained tones, calling it a sorrow that had broken her mother's parents and led to the loss of everything they had. Their family home, a sprawling plot of land upriver known as Jessup's Landing, had been confiscated by the Union Army as the property of a traitor. This piece of paper, this pardon, would have saved him. It would have saved all of them. It had been right here, sealed in the dark, while her grandfather walked to the gallows. The weight of it was suffocating. As she sat there on the cold iron floor, lost in a history she had just unearthed, a low rumble vibrated through the hull of the ship. The air, which had been still, began to move, a low moan winding through the wreck. She scrambled out of the boiler room and up the ladders. When she emerged onto the deck, the sky to the west was a bruised, churning wall of black. A Mississippi storm, a true monster, was bearing down on them, the wind preceding it already tearing at the water, whipping it into a frenzy. The river was rising, climbing the muddy banks with an unnatural speed. This was her test. She had the gold. She had the contracts. She could fill her pockets, abandon the ship and its ghosts, and disappear. She could buy a new life, far away from the river that had taken her father and the shame that had haunted her family. But the pardon was different. It wasn't about money. It was about a name. It was about justice, 20 years too late. It was about her father, who had lived his life under the weight of a dishonor that was never his. As she stood paralyzed by the choice, a shout, thin and desperate, cut through the howl of the wind. Out on the swollen, churning river, a small flatboat was in trouble. The family aboard, a man, a woman, and 2 small children huddled together, had lost power and were being swept sideways toward a massive snag of fallen trees and debris that would tear their small craft to pieces. In that instant, the choice was gone, replaced by pure, unthinking instinct. She grabbed the coils of heavy rope she'd been using to haul supplies. Securing one end to the main capstan on the Morning Glory's foredeck, she worked her way to the edge of the listing hull, the wind and rain tearing at her. She yelled to the man on the boat, her voice raw. She threw the rope once, twice, the wind snatching it away. On the 3rd try, he caught it. With the rope secured to his boat, the fight began. Cora wrapped the line around the capstan, using its leverage, her feet braced against the deck. The current was a monstrous, living thing, pulling the flatboat toward the snag. But the Morning Glory, her dead weight half buried in the earth, became an anchor. Slowly, foot by agonizing foot, Cora hauled them in, the man on the boat pulling with her. Finally, the flatboat bumped hard against the steamship's iron hull. She helped the terrified family, a farmer named Thomas, his wife Sarah, and their 2 wide-eyed children, scramble aboard her wreck. She led them to the captain's quarters, which she had recently cleared of debris. It was dry and sheltered from the worst of the wind. She built a small fire in the rusted stove, shared her meager supplies of food, and gave them her own wool blanket. She chose to shelter these strangers, to commit to the place she now stood. All night, the storm raged. The river rose, slamming against the morning glory, making the old ship groan and shudder as if it might be torn from its muddy grave. But it held. The wreck that everyone had called a coffin became an ark. By morning, the storm had broken. A weak, watery sunlight filtered through the clouds, illuminating a world transformed. The river was a brown, churning torrent, littered with debris, but it had begun to recede. The family was safe. The father, Thomas, was a plain-spoken farmer whose land was a few miles upriver. He looked at Cora, his face etched with a gratitude so profound it needed few words. "You saved us," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "My children, you saved them." As they waited for the water to calm, Cora, moved by the night's events, found herself telling him her story. She showed him the pardon. Thomas, a man who understood the value of land and a good name better than anyone, was stunned into silence. He looked from the pardon to the rusted hull of the ship around them. "This isn't a wreck, miss," he said finally, his voice full of awe. "It's a vault." He vowed then and there to help her in any way he could. When Thomas and his family were able to safely return to their farm, the story of their rescue traveled with them. It moved through Haven's Landing not as a whisper, but as a tale told with reverence. The girl on the riverbank, the fool, had saved the Miller family. The mockery that had followed Cora like a shadow evaporated. The whispers changed. The Rust Queen was forgotten, replaced by the girl on the Glory. She was no longer an outcast. She was a fixture, a part of the river's story. A few weeks later, accompanied by Thomas for protection, Cora journeyed to Memphis. She carried the leather pouch, the tin of contracts, and a small, heavy sack of gold coins. She went straight to the office of Mr. Abernathy. The old clerk's jaw dropped as she laid the contents of the captain's hold on his desk. He stared at the pardon, his eyes welling with tears. "Your father," he whispered. If he had known. He sprang into action, his worry replaced by a fierce, protective energy. He led her to the law offices of a Mr. Davies, a quiet, serious man known for his integrity. The kind professional who could navigate the labyrinth of post-war property claims. Mr. Davies examined the documents with meticulous care. He spent a day consulting military archives and land registry records. The next afternoon, he called her back to his office. His face was calm, but his eyes held a deep respect. "The pardon is authentic, Miss Jessup," he stated. "It was issued, but the courier's vessel, the Morning Glory, was reported lost in a storm. The pouch was presumed sunk with all hands." He paused, then slid another document across the desk. "This is the order of confiscation for the property of Alistair Finch. The pardon, being dated prior to the execution, retroactively nullifies the conviction, which means this order is void." He let the words sink in. "The land, all 200 acres of Jessup's Landing, is, and legally has always been, yours." He went on to explain that the cotton futures, tied to that same land, were also valid, a staggering windfall. The news rippled through the county land office. One afternoon, as Cora was leaving the Memphis courthouse, she saw Silas Croft on the street. He was on his way to see his own lawyer, no doubt having heard that his attempts to acquire the abandoned Jessup property had been blocked. Their eyes met across the dusty street. For a moment she expected a sneer, a final contemptuous dismissal. Instead, he stopped. He slowly raised a hand to his hat and tipped it in a gesture of silent, unambiguous defeat. Then he turned and walked away. The town that had laughed at her now saw her for what she was, not a fool who had bought a wreck, but the keeper of a history they had all chosen to forget. A year passed, the seasons turned, and the river rose and fell with its ancient rhythm. It was spring again, and the air was soft with the smell of damp earth and new leaves. The morning glory was still beached on its muddy throne, but it was no longer a skeleton. Cora had used a small portion of the gold not to raise the ship, but to save it. A local crew, managed by Thomas, had stabilized the hull with heavy timbers, replaced the rotted decks with new planking, and patched the leaking roof of the upper cabins. The entire vessel had been scraped clean of the worst rust and given a fresh coat of white paint, its name repainted in proud black letters. It was no longer a wreck. It was a landmark. It was her home. The Grand Saloon, cleared of its mold and ruin, was now a bright, airy living space, its windows looking out over the water. The farmer Thomas and his family, now her closest friends, had a small, thriving farm just a mile away, and his children often came to play on the wide, safe decks of the ship they called the Big White Boat. One evening at golden hour, Mr. Abernathy came to visit from Memphis. He and Cora stood together on the upper deck, leaning against the rail, looking out at the river. The setting sun cast a warm, amber light over everything. Across the water, on the land that was now hers, columns of smoke rose from clearing fires. Jessup's Landing was being prepared for its first planting in over 20 years. The lawyers settled the last of the cotton contracts. Mr. Abernathy said quietly, "You're a wealthy woman, Cora. Wealthier than Silas Croft, I'd wager. You could build a mansion here. You could go anywhere in the world." Cora didn't take her eyes off the land. She thought of the gold still locked away, the piles of paper that translated to immense fortune. They felt distant, like someone else's story. Her gaze drifted from the land back to the solid deck beneath her feet, to the gentle rock and sway of the great, wounded ship that had become a part of her. She had come here with nothing but $1 and a name she thought was worthless. She had found a fortune, but the money felt like the least of it. It was a tool, nothing more. Mr. Abernathy watched her, his old, kind face full of affection. "What will you do now?" he asked. Cora drew a deep breath of the river air, fragrant with cottonwood and willow. She finally turned her eyes from the horizon and looked at the aging ship around her, at its sturdy rails and painted smokestacks. "The gold just bought the tools," she said, her voice quiet but clear as a bell. "The pardon bought back my name." She paused, a small, serene smile touching her lips as she looked back at her friend. "But I think all I ever really bought for that $1 was a place to stand." Thank you for joining us for this story of quiet courage. It reminds us that true inheritance isn't what we are given, but what we choose to reclaim. If you were moved by Cora's journey, please leave a like and a comment below, and be sure to subscribe for more stories from the forgotten corners of history. We'll see you next time, when a simple locket found in a dusty attic unravels a secret that will change a town forever.